Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. This one is going to be my final speculation before the Shadow of Kyoshi releases. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the moments from the Rise of Kyoshi that are going to sort of set up stuff in the Shadow of Kyoshi, as well as a few of the sort of stuff we learned from maybe some of the preview content, interviews about Shadow of Kyoshi that we have to expect. And like I said, just general speculation, final thoughts, because I expect that I'll be receiving my copy of the book in the next couple of days, meaning that I do think I might have it before release date. My copy has shipped already. It shipped yesterday, but shipping is slow, of course, because of the virus, but I still think Saturday, Sunday, maybe Monday, I will have the book. So it means that the likelihood of me getting my review out, like initial non-spoiler review out for the release date, is fairly high unless there's unforeseen delays. But anyway, let's get into it, and let's start off straight away with just, we've read the Rise of Kyoshi. What are the events from the Rise of Kyoshi that are directly going to link into the Shadow of Kyoshi? What has it set up that still needs to be resolved? In my mind, there's basically two plot points that really need to be brought back. And realistically, they probably are quite linked in many ways. So the first one is just the very ending of the Rise of Kyoshi, and that is Kyoshi is finally contacted by Avatar Kuruk. And he's going to warn her about something, I guess. So this is where it gets into this idea of, most people are assuming, and I think it makes sense, is this going to be finally when we get the full story of what exactly happened to Avatar Kuruk? Because we've only known very small bits and pieces about Avatar Kuruk. What he talked about to Aang in Sozin's Comet, his section of Escape from the Spirit World, as well as the way they talk about him for most of the Rise of Kyoshi, is he was this kind of negligent avatar who just did his own thing, wasn't particularly active as the avatar. It was mostly an era of peace, but the thing that he, I suppose, his inactivity, sort of allowed to happen in the world was the rise of the Dao Fei, and I suppose pirates as well. But basically bandits across the world sort of rising up in an era post Yang Chen and him being inactive. And that of course causes his companions to have to develop their more sort of grisly reputations for how they sort of handle things in the aftermath of Kuruk's death. But it still remains a little bit of a mystery just how exactly things went so wrong for Kuruk. We know the general specifics around the last, I suppose, years of his life with the idea of him getting engaged to Umi and Ko taking Umi during their wedding. And the impression you get is that the reason Kuruk died so young was that he basically drove himself into an early grave, constantly going to the spirit world to try and go after Ko and get Umi back. That's the impression you get, but is that the full story? They tease the idea of I think it's, is it Jonzu or Kelsang at one point in the Rise of Kyoshi just mentions, and the incident with Umi happened so quickly it makes everyone's head spin. They just address that thing happened without ever going into it. So there's clearly more of a story that will probably, I think, maybe help us to explain what Kuruk was actually trying to do. And I'm thinking the way they're going to do this is that maybe him going into the spirit world, he found out about something that Ko was maybe a part of with other spirits that was a setup for something they're trying to do. This being the setup for the Shadow of Kyoshi that we know, the blurb basically for the book says, a threat emerges from the spirit world that threatens. That's something Kyoshi's going to have to deal with in the Fire Nation. And the fact that Kuruk is warning her about this incident from sort of his time that he's aware of, that Kyoshi's now going to have to deal with, that to me sort of fits, that what he sort of suffered at the hands of Ko is going to maybe come back in present day. That seems quite interesting, and I suppose this might be where it links into the whole Father Glowworm thing and so on, because the other big event is Yoon in general. Yoon has to come back into things. He sort of made a surprise return at the end of Rise of Kyoshi, appearing to kill Jianzhu seemingly effortlessly, because what was so impressive about that scene was that Kyoshi and Jianzhu are incredibly powerful earthbenders, and they're basically in an earthbending struggle with Lex Rock to try and kill each other. And Yoon just sort of steps in between them and just like grabs it. He takes that rock out of the grip of both Kyoshi and Jianzhu, and then just earthbends it through Jianzhu to kill him. He takes his revenge, that you sort of understand, because of course the person Jianzhu betrayed the most pretty much was Yoon. He was all behind him of, I found the new avatar. Yoon basically thought of him as a father figure, and then the second Jianzhu found out Yoon wasn't the avatar and Kyoshi was, he switched attention and abandoned Yoon to die. So the revenge, warranted to a degree, but it was the way in which Yoon went about it that causes the problems. He didn't care for the other people in that restaurant or shop or whatever it was, where Kyoshi and Jianzhu were fighting, and he just took the place down. And was sort of like, you deal with it, Kyoshi. That he didn't seem to particularly care if Kyoshi got caught in it or anything like that. He seemed to think it was fun. A very different character than we knew from before. And the descriptions of Kyoshi like looking at him, that he's sort of like he looks okay, but there's this sense of like him rotting or something like that. There's something is very wrong with him. Slight tease maybe that he's been corrupted by Father Glowworm, that he's been like spirit morphed, whatever way you want to call it. The idea of a spirit going into a human to alter them in some way, like we saw with Tokuga, Yao, and I suppose effectively the Avatar is kind of like that as well, with Rava passing through Wan. So that's the question going into this book. What exactly has happened to Yoon? The impression I get is that he hasn't died. We basically know that the prologue of the book is going to be a chapter with Yoon sort of explaining the core behind what has actually happened to him. And so it seems like he hasn't died, but he's been affected by a spirit in some way, Glowworm. But then the question becomes, what is he trying to do? He is obviously in pain because of what happened to him, betrayed by Jianzhu, and then having to deal with the fact that the thing he was so behind, so the thing he so wanted, he was completely behind the idea that he was the Avatar. And as much as he said to Kyoshi that if it has to be anyone except me, it should be you, he fully believed it was him, and that it wasn't really much of a possibility that someone else could be the Avatar. So he was destroyed basically by the reveal that he wasn't the Avatar. So if he has been altered by a spirit, maybe he has come to take something that he usually wouldn't blame Kyoshi for, because Kyoshi didn't choose to be the Avatar. He has come to actually blame her for maybe ruining his life. But he had an opportunity to take revenge on Kyoshi at the end of that book, but he didn't. So how does he view Kyoshi? What is he actually trying to do? In the sense of like, he's got what he fundamentally wants, revenge against Jianzhu, but what does he actually want to accomplish? Which gets into maybe the idea of like, okay, a spirit plot. What do the spirits want? What are the spirits maybe trying to get at humans for? And it may link into Ko and what happened to Karuk, because again, we're in the Fire Nation here, so what's exactly gone on here? How's the spirit plot going to take place in the Fire Nation? That's going to be very interesting to see what's happened. Like, Kyoshi is, I suppose, in the time skip between these books, been on the lookout for any information on Yoon, but I suppose he's suddenly going to rise up again in the Fire Nation, and I guess it will link into whatever spirit plot is happening. The question, I think, behind this really is, what spirits are involved? How connected to everything is it? And then most importantly, for the characters, I suppose, how much hope is there for Yoon going forward? Is there hope that Kyoshi could like change Yoon back? If she removes the spirit influence from him, can he return to the way he was before? Or is he forever going to be the villain? Is she going to have to like put down Yoon? is I suppose the question, because that's seemingly in a way what they're trying to do here, of like only justice can bring peace. That Kyoshi's advice is always, you do what you have to do to bring peace to the world, and if Yoon is the one threatening it, is this going to be her having to do the hard thing again, where she had to sort of kill Zhu Ping on in the first book, and now she seems fairly okay with just taking criminals down all day. Is this going to be the challenge of like, bring justice even if it's your friends causing the issues, and how far does her view on that go? That's the question here, of like her, I suppose, love basically for Yoon, versus her newfound sense of justice. And the fact that I think the prologue and the early chapters that we've got previewed for the second book seem to be getting across the idea. She is, maybe without fully wanting to, she is gradually becoming a little bit more like Jianzhu, being so almost like pragmatic about having to resolve things, that she's willing to go to extremes to accomplish them, in the same way that he was. If someone needs to be taken out, she'll do it. And it's going to be, I suppose, just that balance across the book of, Kyoshi, by the fandom outside of The Rise of Kyoshi, like before we got this book, Kyoshi was always that like, lol, Kyoshi's just going to kill everyone. Her advice is always just kill first, ask questions later. This helped to explain how she went from being someone who didn't really feel that way to getting on that side of things. But they still want to be nuanced with it, that yes, Kyoshi is ultimately the avatar who is all about justice, but it's not that level of kind of like bluntness that she has. So I still think they'll want to continue that general atmosphere, tone to the character, of there being some level of being conflicted about these things, but still being willing to go through with it, which I suppose is going to be potentially the dynamic between Kyoshi and Rangi in this book. Of Rangi, after I suppose about a year, I guess, or a couple of months away from each other, she's going to encounter a Kyoshi who is now much more open and willing to do all of this stuff. That she was never happy in the first book that Kyoshi sort of adapted to being Dao Fei so quickly, because she doesn't think the Avatar should be part of that side of things. But Kyoshi is 100% Dao Fei. She does not like world leaders. And while she's not bad Dao Fei like Mok and the Yellownecks and stuff like that, she still doesn't fundamentally like most world leaders and that style of doing things. She more is supportive of, I suppose, the better ideals that the better Dao Fei actually have, like the Flying Opera Company. So we'll see, I suppose, how Rangi views Kyoshi being maybe disrespectful towards the Fire Lord, not taking the politics and the way to go about things as seriously, and that could bring them into conflict from someone who expects the Avatar to be a specific way. That's going to be quite interesting to see, of just how maybe dark a path they have Kyoshi sort of go down in terms of how much like Jianzhu she's becoming, and if Rangi ever calls her out on that. That's going to be quite interesting, especially if she's doing this in Rangi's homeland. Which brings us into the other thing that we know is going to happen in this book. We're going to get Rangi Backstory. Now, how exactly they do this is going to be quite interesting, in the sense of, we didn't actually learn that much backstory about Rangi from the first book. We pretty much just know she's sort of like, daughter of a sort of more noble Fire Nation family, not one of the absolute high-ups, but there and thereabouts, has, gone to the Royal Fire Academy for girls, has officer training basically within the Fire Nation army, is a skilled firebender, absolutely. It makes sense because of how skilled her mother was and so on. And so, there's a sort of similarity there between mother and daughter to a degree, just how skilled Rangi is. So I think that the backstory perhaps is going to be more about what happened to her father, because I believe it is a thing in the first book that they confirm that her father is not around anymore. He did die at some point. And that, what was it? Heiran was, I think, either engaged or just recently married to Rangi's father, in or around the time Karuk was about to give the sort of love letter poem to Heiron, and Kelsang, of course, stopped that from happening. So how did that come about? What are Rangi's views on her father? Is she even knew him? I might need to look actually that up again to see the details on it. I can't remember when the details on that are. So she may not know her father that well, or he might have had an effect on her to a certain point. But again, what happened is I suppose the question there. How does she view more of a sense of what's happened to her mother, both learning about her past in the first book, as well as the fact that going into this book, Heiron is still recovering from the poisoning, and how much of an effect has that had? Is there lasting damage? Is this going to be a Korra situation where it's going to take time for her to get back, but she will recover fully, or is there going to be lasting damage? What situation is Heiron in this book, and how does Rangi feel about that? That could mean Kyoshi's return is a very important thing for Rangi going into this book, in terms of just having someone to support her there. Outside of that, it's kind of like, is there a way to have Rangi's backstory link more into the plot? It's hard to exactly tell, but that's the sort of stuff from the first book, based on what we don't know, that I'd want, is stuff about her father and mother, of course, I suppose, just in the general stuff in the Fire Nation. Why not cover these topics? So in terms of other characters, I don't really expect to see a lot of the other members of the Flying Opera Company. That's sort of excluding Lao Ge. I think he will be a decent player. I think he'll have sort of similar type role to the way he had in the first book, in this book. But like Wong, Kirima, I don't really think we'll be seeing that much of those characters. That they might just be a quick, maybe we'll see them a little bit at the start, a little bit at the end type thing, but not really around for the most part. I'd like to see them addressed, just to acknowledge that they were bending teachers for her. But beyond that, I don't really see them playing a role. Lao Ge is important enough to where, for sure, that there'll be more with him. And hopefully there'll be more reveals about him and the whole how you live to be older situation, which, you can view as being sort of resolved from the first book, but like I think I'd like more information on it in general, and just more about Lao Ge and the idea of, through him, maybe a sense for why Kyoshi chooses to live to be 230 years old. We know now how that happens, but we don't know the whys really about it. If it's a choice, you do a technique to live longer, why does she continue to do that for 230 years? That's the main question. As for other characters, like, they did kill off a decent amount of the cast in the first book. Like, Kelsang's dead, Janzu's dead, Lek is dead. So we are down a bunch of characters here, as well as the fact that Janzu killed off a lot of the leadership of the Earth Kingdom in terms of the other sages and so on. So if we are Fire Nation focused, I guess it is primarily going to be a lot of new characters in the Fire Nation. Like, it's going to be Heiron, Rangi, Kyoshi, Monk Jinpa, I suppose, is going to be there. We know that from the early preview pages of the book. But beyond that, I don't really see there being too much of the other sort of more recurring characters from the first book, which is going to be quite interesting to see how they do that. Balancing just all these new characters and then what characters they do bring back and so on. The other thing we know is that this book is going to reveal to us what sort of animal Kyoshi's animal guide is. So this is actually a pretty big topic. I know a lot of people have been excited since this has been revealed, and I am too, because the impression that I get is that this is going to have to be a little bit of a plot in the book, that she's going to encounter an animal and is going to make a bond with it to the point where they travel with each other for the rest of their lives. And how does that sort of happen? What animal is it? And especially these books, which are typically more detailed than anything else we get in the franchise, I'm very interested to see how the book describes Kyoshi's view on this animal. Like, is it just she meets an animal, happens to become friendly with it, and they continue together? Or do they talk about it more that, like, Kyoshi sensed a connection with this animal deep down, spiritually, like that sort of way? Like, really get across the idea that Animal Guide is a spiritual connection in the same way that sort of the connection from avatars to each other is spiritual and so on. In the sense that Aang and Appa, that connection isn't just like Appa's a close animal friend of Appa. They're so close. They are best friends. It's the same with Korra and Naga. It's more than just a pet. It's so much more than that. The fact that Fang went back to die with Roku during the volcano eruption was a really profound moment in terms of really getting across the idea of the animal guides. The fact that Fang, there's like a spirit of Fang as well. That is one of the key scenes that gets across the idea of, like, there has to be a spiritual connection as well. And is the animal guide of the Avatar a reincarnation as well? Stuff like that. Just, basically, is there something more to it, or is it just friendly animal? But then, yeah, what animal is it? Typically, you'd expect an Avatar to have an animal that is sort of useful. Its physicality is useful to some degree. So some sort of an animal that can be used to ride on. That's with Appa, sky bison, you can fly. Polar bear dog is obviously great for traveling as well. The same with Mula the cat deer. Juan was able to ride her, and the same with the dragon. So is it going to be an animal like that? And then typically you'd be like, okay, big, strong animal to match Kyoshi, who's also big and strong. She meets it in the Fire Nation, I guess. So what could it be? There's a bunch of different like hybrid tiger-like animals, hybrid bear animals you could go for, like armadillo bear or something like that. A more powerful animal. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be that. It could just be a smaller animal like a Momo. Where it is just an animal who more like sits on Kyoshi's shoulder, and you reverse the dynamic of Kyoshi's the really big member of the two of them, and her animal companion is more of a companion than like someone who will like fly them around or whatever. That's what's so interesting about this, because it could be an animal we know about, or it could be a new animal. Just the fact that he used it as a tease, to me, maybe has me leaning more in the direction that it probably is maybe an animal we've heard about before. Hence why it's maybe significant that, like, we know what it is. Just because if it is a new animal, then it kind of feels like, okay, cool, new animal, but there's more impact if it is maybe something we know about before. Like, Badger Mole feels like, that's a go-to Earth Avatar, Badger Mole Animal Guide, but it might feel a little bit like too on the nose, like, where's she going to find a badger mole in the Fire Nation? So there's that. Like, I don't think it's out of the question that that Kyoshi also had a dragon or something like that it's a different sky bison. But I think the fact that Pung Pung has sort of like come and gone more or less within the story, to me, probably says her animal guide isn't going to be a sky bison, probably isn't going to be one of the other bending animals like badger mole or dragon. So it probably has to be something more along the lines of maybe a polar bear dog style animal, which is why I lean more towards maybe like some sort of a tiger hybrid or bear hybrid type thing, maybe. It could be an aquatic animal. We ultimately don't know really. So that's going to be fun to see how it happens. Like, is Kyoshi on her own when she finds it? Is she with Rangi? Etc. We're obviously going to learn a lot about the Fire Nation, which is going to be fun. Meeting this Fire Lord is also going to be quite interesting, because it's going to be a Fire Lord pre-Sozin. So that means it's going to be the Fire Nation before it goes full on evil, but it's still probably going to be a Fire Nation that is making progress to being such a prosperous nation. So we'll see how exactly that goes. Is it going to be more about the Fire Lord, you view him as a bad person? That's probably going to be the way they go about it, to make Kyoshi be justified in her perhaps hatred of world leaders and having the more Dao Fei view on things, is that she actually thinks the Fire Lord is corrupt in some way. It's also a way you could potentially bring out more conflict between Kyoshi and Rangi if Kyoshi is being actively antagonistic towards the Fire Lord because she doesn't like him. That could be an interesting point. But again, until we get more information on that, it's sort of hard to speculate exactly in terms of what's going on there, how does the spirit plot come into play, what is trying to be accomplished here, etc. Either way, we're going to get to see the Fire Nation before it gets all, imperial, I suppose, and then it becomes super technological, and we'll maybe get more of the culture how it was before. Now, are we going to see like Flameo Hotman and stuff like that as we go forward? That's hard to speculate on exactly, but it would sort of make sense. But again, as we know, the whole Flameo Hotman thing is kind of more of just slang that Kuzan did than anything. So that's quite interesting. Beyond that, like that's pretty much everything based on, like, I suppose, information that we kind of know going into the next book. So let's talk more about just my expectations of it. I think the book is going to be good. I think I have faith in the author being able to deliver another book that this time, instead of the Earth Kingdom and developing like the Dao Fei, it'll develop the Fire Nation and I suppose the royalty of that era. And they'll play the dynamic of Kyoshi with politics very well. Rangi Backstory, bringing Yoon into play. We're going to have Kyoshi connecting with the other avatars because we're past the origin story bit of the story. I think that's all going to work fine. I think what is going to potentially be a problem with this book is how it comes to an end. Because I think a lot of people, I get the feeling, will come out of this book feeling that, why isn't there a third? Why isn't this a more extended series? Why did they only choose to do 2 books? Because the impression I get is that we are going to end with Kyoshi still in her teenage years, and we're not going to do any sort of time skip ahead. We're not going to touch on any of the details surrounding events from later in her life or even the middle of her life. That we are literally just YA here, teenage Kyoshi. And I think that is ultimately going to go down as a mistake, because it's not that I think they needed to full on tell her full life story within this series. I think they could have done that if they wanted to, but I sort of get why they didn't. I think the problem here is going to be more of not showing anything into the future. That you've told this origin for the character, and you're going to end it there, with the assumption being that, oh, you already know who Kyoshi is when she's older. When it's like, yeah, but you basically sold these books on the basis of, like, this is this legendary character who lives to be 230 years old. Here's the origin story. And it's like, okay, you've told us, like, technically how she lives to be 230 years old, but we don't get to see her at those ages, in that it still means Kyoshi's life is basically still completely not fleshed out. Because effectively now we have this, like, her at, like, 17, 18 is now going to be this really loaded section of her story, because there's a book covering those years. 2 books covering those years. Then there's going to be like a time skip of about 22 years or so, to the point where she's maybe in her 40s, to when the Qin the Conqueror incident happens, the Peasant Uprising in Ba Sing Se incident happens fairly shortly after that, and then her forming the Kyoshi Warriors also happens in or around that same general time period of her life. And then the only other things we really know about Kyoshi are that at some point she has a daughter who is named Coco, and that's really it. We just know that there's a daughter, and that the girl Coco that we meet in ATLA on Kyoshi Island is named after Kyoshi's daughter Coco, who at some point was the leader of Kyoshi Island. But that still leaves, like I said, it still leaves the remaining like 190 years of her life to be explored, in addition to like about 20 or so years in between where the book is going to end and the first of the ATLA incidents we hear about with her. And I think that's going to be the frustration for people of, yes, you are going to have people wishing that this book basically retold the whole Qin the Conqueror story with more depth, because it does need more depth. As much as Avatar Day told that story, it's also fair to say it told it in a bit of a comedic way. Despite Shin the Conqueror actually being a sort of Kuvira-esque threat to the Earth Kingdom, they're a little bit jokey about it, despite bringing some seriousness into it towards the end. And then the Peasant Uprising of Ba Sing Se is a cool event that you can sort of place the context of where it takes place in terms of the aftermath of Chin's death and so on, but it would be great to get a book like this giving us full context, explaining the full meaning behind that, to add more connections. Same with the Kyoshi Warrior story, which is just randomly told in the Shell's short story. I'd like to know more about that, and especially stuff like Coco, because my prediction is just I don't think they'll kill off Rangi. That's just my thoughts on this. I don't think they're going to kill off Rangi. So I think we'll end with them still as a couple, which then kind of brings up the question like Coco? Can we explain Coco? Are they just gonna have to be like, oh, she's an adopted daughter, I guess, maybe, or what? Again, not knowing the full plot of the book and how it plays out, especially with regards to like Yoon and so on, it's difficult to fully put all the pieces together. But I think the book is going to end, and it's going to feel like we still don't fully know the story of Kyoshi, that there's still so many options to tell stories, and because we have the origin now told quite heavily, and then we have sort of a batch of incidents towards the middle of her life, and then a few other scattered things, it's going to feel still like a very scattered character that we don't know the full details for. Versus, say, Roku, where just in one episode it feels like you've encountered his whole story, because his, grew up with Sozin, becomes the Avatar, very standard training as the Avatar, with, I suppose, just the standard stuff happening, and then the main incident in his life was Sozin. Like, he's fine, it's probably like there's maybe another story there for him somewhere, but you get most of it. Whereas I think it is going to feel with Kyoshi that there's still a lot of other stuff to be told with her, and the author is instead going to decide that no, this is enough, this is what you needed. And I'm very interested to see how I feel when I do get to the end of the book, kind of knowing that it's not going to have like an extended journey through her life at the end. Because I think it might end up feeling a little bit like, well, to a degree, would it not maybe have been better to just do a slightly extended Rise of Kyoshi book that maybe features some resolution on Yoon and leave it at that? And maybe that this secondary book maybe wasn't as needed as you thought it was, if you weren't planning to go sort of all in on Kyoshi's story. How much of a sense of finality is there going to be to this, knowing that it is just two books, and we've known that from the beginning, that there's only these two books, especially when we don't know what's happening with novels after the Shadow of Kyoshi. We don't know that, we don't have any comics announced really, and we're just in that same situation that we've been in the last few months. I hope the book can deliver, and it's going to be one of those ones where I hope the book is good enough to where it counteracts maybe some of the negativity that there's probably going to be around the fact that the book is going to be somewhat limited in scope in relation to Kyoshi's life. That, like I said at the start, like going back to videos I did when this book was first announced, before it was even out, and my expectations for it was that I hope they don't miss this opportunity to flesh out her entire life. That I know it's YA, but I hope they don't just do Teenage Kyoshi, and it looks like that's what they're doing. That's the one fear I have, and I think it's going to be a pretty valid issue that people have with the book when it comes out, that it maybe is needlessly limiting itself to just one era of Kyoshi's life, when it could have featured a little bit more. Because now that there's a level of finality to, like, we've done the second book, they've been very clear about that. They've almost like locked themselves out of, like, they can't just announce a third book, but at the same time, when are we going to ever get more information about Kyoshi? that would announce to us like the details around Coco and stuff like that. But again, maybe they're just going to leave it like that and do the usual Avatar problem of like, oh, you care about the characters' families? We as creators don't. Like, it doesn't matter if you know who the parents of certain characters are or whatever, which has always been a weird thing with Avatar. Like, how do we still not know who, like, Izumi's mother is? How do we still not know anything about Sokka's life for the most part? I assume they're going to leave Kyoshi in a similar position, so that's that. But yeah, I'm very excited for this book. So excited that like it's like all I can really think about right now in terms of like Avatar content is just the book is going to arrive in a few days. All I want to do is just prepare for that sort of content, and I can't really think about that much. That's why I haven't done too many commentary track videos of late. It's just because who cares about the show? The new book is coming out. But yeah, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are, your final thoughts on the Shadow of Kyoshi heading into the release of the book in a week's time. So that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.